Richard Morrison was a very rich man who had worked hard his entire life to build his business empire from nothing, and now he owned one of the biggest technology companies in the whole country, which made him more money than he could ever spend. In 10 lifetimes, and his success had brought him a massive mansion on top of a hill that overlooked the entire city below, where all the lights twinkled at night like stars had fallen from the sky and landed on the ground beneath his feet, and the mansion itself was something people only saw in magazines, with tall white columns at the front, and windows so big you could see your reflection from 50 feet away, and inside there were rooms he had never even entered because there were just too many of them to count, and the furniture was all imported from Europe and Asia and cost more than most people made in a year. But Richard had grown used to this kind of life after 20 years of being at the top, and he barely noticed the luxury anymore because it had become normal to him, like breathing or walking. The gardens around his mansion were especially beautiful, and they stretched out in every direction with perfectly cut green grass that looked like a carpet and flower. Beds full of roses and tulips and exotic plants that needed special care to survive in this climate, and there were stone paths that wound through the gardens like rivers and fountains that shot water high into the air and came back down in sparkling streams, and taking care of all this beauty required a team of workers who came every day to trim and water and plant and make sure everything looked perfect for Richard, even though he rarely took the time to actually walk through the gardens and appreciate their beauty because he was always too busy with meetings and phone calls and business deals that needed his attention. And among all these workers was a man named Samuel Jenkins, who had been working as the head groundskeeper for the estate for nearly 8 years now, and he was responsible for making sure the grass was cut at exactly the right height and the flowers bloomed at the right time and the trees were pruned properly, and he did his job well and quietly without ever causing any problems or asking for anything. Extra Samuel was in his late 50s with dark skin that had been weathered by years of working outside in the sun and rain, and his hair was starting to turn gray at the temples, and he had kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled, though he did not smile very often these days, because life had been hard on him lately in ways that nobody at the mansion knew about, and he always arrived at work exactly on time at 7 in the morning, and he left exactly at 5 in the afternoon, and he kept to himself mostly, and did not talk much with the other workers who came and went throughout the day, and Richard Morrison barely knew anything about him except that he was reliable and good at his job, and that was all Richard thought he needed to know about the man who took care of his gardens for 8 long years. On a Tuesday afternoon in late summer when the air was thick and humid and made your shirt stick to your back, even when you were just standing still, Richard came home earlier than usual from the city because a big meeting he was supposed to attend had been canceled at the last minute, and he was actually happy about this because meetings were exhausting, even though they were necessary, and he thought maybe he would take a swim in his pool or just sit on the terrace with a cold drink and enjoy the rare moment of free time in his busy schedule. And when he walked through the French doors that opened, from his living room onto the garden terrace, he was thinking about which drink he wanted to make for himself and whether he should call his personal chef to prepare an early dinner. But then something caught his eye near the rose bushes on the far side of the garden, and at first he could not quite understand what he was seeing because it looked wrong somehow, like a puzzle piece that did not fit. There was Samuel down on his hands and knees in the grass, but he was not doing any of the normal gardening work that Richard would have expected to see, and instead he was pulling up handfuls of grass from the ground with his bare hands and bringing the grass to his mouth and eating it like it was food, like he was some kind of animal, grazing in a field, and Richard stood there completely frozen, unable to move or speak, because his brain could not process what his eyes were showing him, and he watched as Samuel stuffed another handful of grass into his mouth and chewed it slowly, with his eyes closed like he was trying to convince himself that it tasted good, or at least that it was filling the empty space in his stomach, and his hands were shaking slightly as he reached down for more grass, and Richard could see that his Clothes hung loosely on his frame like he had lost weight recently, and his face looked thinner than Richard remembered, though he had to admit he had not really looked at Samuel's face closely in a very long time. Richard felt something strange happening in his chest, like his heart was squeezing tight, and he did not know if he should look away and pretend he had not seen this, or if he should say something or do something, but his feet seemed glued to the stone terrace and he could not move. And he just kept watching as this man who had worked for him for 8 years ate grass from his garden, like he had no other choice. And there was something so desperate and sad about the way Samuel moved that it made Richard feel uncomfortable, in a way he had not felt in many years. And finally, after what seemed like forever, but was probably only a minute or two, Samuel looked up and their eyes met across the garden, and the expression on Samuel's face was one of pure shame and horror, like a child who had been caught doing something terrible, and he quickly stood up and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, trying to remove the evidence of what he had been doing. Richard found his voice finally, though it came out strange and rough, like he had not used it in days, and he heard himself say, "What on earth are you doing?" Samuel and the words hung in the air between them, and Samuel looked down at the ground, unable to meet his employer's eyes anymore, and his whole body seemed to shrink, like he wanted to disappear into the earth beneath his feet. And Richard started walking toward him across the garden, his expensive leather shoes crunching on the gravel path, and when he got closer he could see that there were actually tears forming in the corners of Samuel's eyes, and the older man was breathing hard like he had been running, even though he had just been kneeling in the grass, and Richard stopped a few feet away, not knowing what to say next, because how? Do you ask someone why they were eating grass without making them feel even worse than they already obviously felt? Samuel's voice, when he finally spoke, was so quiet that Richard had to lean forward to hear him, and he said, "I am so sorry, Mr. Morrison. I did not think anyone would see me, and I know this looks bad, and I know you must think I am crazy, but I promise you, I am not crazy. I am just hungry." And Richard felt those words hit him like a physical blow to his stomach, and he said, "What do you mean, hungry?" And Samuel looked up at him finally with those tired, kind eyes that were now full of pain and shame and desperation, all mixed together. And Richard realized in that moment that he had been living in a bubble for so long, surrounded by wealth and comfort and plenty, that he had forgotten that there were people in the world who did not have enough to eat, and one of those people had been working in his garden for 8 years, taking care of his flowers and his grass, while struggling with his own private suffering that Richard had never bothered to notice or ask about. Richard Morrison walked back into his mansion after his conversation with Samuel, and his legs felt heavy like they were made of stone, and his mind was spinning with thoughts that would not stop coming, and he went straight to his study and sat down in the big leather chair behind his desk and put his head in his hands and just sat there in silence for a long time, trying to process everything he had just learned, and the image of Samuel eating grass kept playing over and over in his mind like a terrible movie that he could not turn off, and every time he saw it in his memory, he felt sick to his stomach and ashamed in a way he had never felt before in his entire life. That evening, his personal chef prepared a beautiful dinner, with grilled salmon and roasted vegetables and a fresh salad and crusty bread and a chocolate dessert that probably cost more than Samuel spent on food in a month, and the chef brought it all to the dining room and set it on the long mahogany table where Richard usually ate alone while reading business reports on his tablet. But tonight Richard just sat there staring at the food, and he could not bring himself to take even one bite, because every time he looked at the abundance in front of him, he thought about Samuel on his hands and knees eating grass, and he thought about Samuel's daughter Maya lying in a hospital bed, and he thought about 2 children who were 8 and 10 years old, wondering when their mother would come home, and whether their grandfather would have enough money to feed them, and the food on Richard's plate suddenly looked obscene and wasteful and wrong. Richard pushed his chair back from the table and stood up and walked through his mansion looking at everything with new eyes, and he saw the expensive paintings on the walls that he had bought from galleries without even thinking about the price, and he saw the imported rugs from Persia that cost tens of thousands of dollars, and he saw the crystal chandelier in the foyer that sparkled with 1,000 lights, and he saw the grand piano in the music room that nobody ever played, and he saw the home theater with seats that cost more than a used car, and he saw the wine cellar filled with bottles that he collected but rarely drank, and everywhere he looked he saw excess and waste and money spent on things that did not matter, while a good man who worked for him had been starving just outside his door. Richard went to his bedroom, but he could not sleep that night, and he lay awake staring at the ceiling and thinking about how he had built his entire empire on the idea that success was measured by wealth and power and achievement, and he had been so focused on making money and growing his company and beating his competitors that he had forgotten to pay attention to the human cost of his success, and he had employees who worked for him and made his life comfortable, and he paid them what he thought was fair, but he had never once considered that fair wages might not be enough when someone faced a catastrophe like a medical emergency, and he realized that he had been living in a bubble completely disconnected from the reality that most people faced every single day. In the morning, Richard did not go to his office in the city, even though he had 3 important meetings scheduled, and he sent messages to his assistants telling them to cancel everything and reschedule for next week, and instead he got into his car and drove across town to the address that Samuel had given him the day before. And it took him 40 minutes to get there because Samuel lived in a neighborhood that Richard had never been to before and probably never would have visited, if not for what had happened, and the houses here were small and old, and some of them needed paint and repairs, and the streets were cracked, and there were no trees lining the sidewalks like there were in Richard's neighborhood, and he felt uncomfortable. And out of place in his expensive car, Richard found Samuel's house, and it was a tiny place with faded blue paint and a small yard with patchy grass, and he parked on the street and walked up to the front door and knocked, and when Samuel answered, he looked shocked and worried, and he said, "Mr. Morrison, what are you doing here, and is something wrong?" And Richard could see the fear in Samuel's eyes, like he thought maybe Richard had come to fire him after all. And Richard said quickly, "No, nothing is wrong, and I am not here to fire you, and I am not here to cause any trouble, and I am here because we need to talk, and I need you to tell me everything about your situation, so I can help." Samuel invited him inside, and the house was clean, but sparse with old furniture that had seen better days, and there were toys scattered on the floor from the grandchildren, and pictures on the walls showing Maya when she was younger and smiling and healthy, and Samuel made coffee in a pot that looked like it was 20 years old, and they sat at a small kitchen table that wobbled slightly on uneven legs, and Richard felt like he had entered a completely different world from the one he lived in, and Samuel started talking and telling Richard everything about Maya's illness and the medical bills that had been piling up for 3 months. Samuel brought out folders full of papers and medical statements and bills from the hospital, and bills from doctors and bills from specialists and bills for medications and tests and procedures, and Richard looked through them all, and he felt his chest tighten as he saw the numbers adding up and up and up, and the total was over $200,000, and Samuel's insurance had covered some of it, but not nearly enough. And there were still massive amounts that Samuel was responsible for paying, and the hospital was demanding payment plans and threatening to send the bills to collections if Samuel could not keep up with the monthly installments, and on top of all that, Maya needed a kidney transplant, which would cost even more money, and she had been on a waiting list for a donor for 2 months now, but the wait could be years, and she might not have years. Richard learned that. Samuel was making payments of $1,500 every month to the hospital, and that was almost his entire paycheck after taxes, and he had taken out a loan against his house to cover the initial costs when Maya first got sick, and he was behind on that loan now, and the bank had sent him notices warning that they might foreclose if he could not catch up on the payments, and Samuel showed Richard his budget written out in careful handwriting on a piece of notebook paper, and Richard saw that there was literally nothing left over after the medical payments and the house payment and the utilities and the children's school supplies, and Samuel had written $0 next to the line that said food for himself. Richard sat there at that wobbly kitchen table in that tiny house, and he felt tears burning in his eyes, and he was not a man who cried easily, but he could not stop the tears from coming, and he said, "Samuel, I had no idea, and I am so sorry that I did not know, and I am sorry that you have been going through this alone." And Samuel said, "It is not your fault, Mr. Morrison, and you have your own life and your own concerns." And Richard said, "No, that is exactly the problem, and I have been so wrapped up in my own life that I forgot to see the people around me as real human beings with real problems and real pain. And you have been working for me for 8 years, and I did not even know you had a daughter, and I did not know you had grandchildren, and I did not know anything about you, except that you showed up on time and did good work." Richard asked about the grandchildren, and Samuel called them into the kitchen, and they came shyly and stood close to their grandfather, and they were beautiful kids, with big brown eyes and careful smiles, and the girl was named Lisa, and the boy was named Marcus, and Richard talked to them for a few minutes and asked them about school and what they liked to do, and they were polite and sweet, and Richard could see that Samuel had raised them well despite all the hardships. And when the children went back to play in their room, Richard looked at Samuel and said, "I am going to help you, and I am going to make sure Maya gets the care she needs." And Samuel started to protest and say that he could not accept that kind of help, but Richard said, "Please let me do this, and not just because it is the right thing to do, but because I need to do this for myself, because I need to become a better person than I have been." Samuel stood there in front of his employer feeling smaller than he had ever felt in his entire life, and all the dignity he had tried to maintain over the past few months seemed to crumble away like old dry leaves turning to dust. And he could not look Richard Morrison in the eye anymore because the shame was too heavy, and it pressed down on his shoulders like an enormous weight that might crush him into the ground, and his hands were still trembling at his sides, and he could taste the bitter grass in his mouth and smell the earth on his fingers, and he wished more than anything that he could just disappear, or that the ground would open up and swallow him whole so he would not have to explain what Richard had just witnessed. But Richard was standing there waiting for an answer, and Samuel knew he could not run away from this moment no matter how much he wanted to. The silence between them stretched out long and uncomfortable, and Samuel could hear the birds singing in, the trees and the fountain splashing water in the distance, and somewhere far away, a car horn honked on the street below the mansion, and all these normal sounds of the world continuing on around them made this moment feel even more unreal and strange. And finally Samuel took a deep breath that shuddered in his chest, and he started to speak in a voice that was so quiet and broken that it did not even sound like his own voice anymore. And he said, "Mr. Morrison, I am truly sorry you had to see that. And I know there is no excuse for what I was doing, and I understand if you want to fire me right now, and I will leave and never come back, and I will not cause any trouble, but please just let me explain first, so you understand that. I am not insane or on drugs or anything like that." Richard did not say anything, but he nodded slightly to show that he was listening, and this small gesture of willingness to hear him out gave Samuel just enough courage to continue, and he said, "I have been so hungry, Mr. Morrison and I did not know what else to do." And the words came out in a rush now, like water breaking through a dam, and he told Richard that his daughter, whose name was Maya, had been in the hospital for 3 months, now fighting for her life because her kidneys had failed, and the doctor said she needed a transplant. But transplants were expensive, and even with insurance, there were so many bills and so many costs that Samuel had never imagined, and every single penny of his salary went straight to the hospital the moment he got paid, and there was nothing left over for anything else, not for food or for gas, or for the electricity bill that kept getting higher, or for his grandchildren who lived with him, because Maya's husband had left her 2 years ago when things got hard. Samuel explained that Maya had two children who were 8 and 10 years old, and they were good kids who deserved to eat proper meals and go to school with clean clothes and shoes that fit their feet. And Samuel made sure they had what they needed, even if it meant he went without. And for the past 2 weeks, he had been skipping breakfast and lunch every single day, and only eating a small dinner at night after the children had gone to bed, so they would not see how little food there was. And he had lost almost 20 pounds in the past few months, and his clothes hung off him, like they belonged to someone else, and he felt weak all the time and dizzy when he stood, up too fast. But he kept working because he needed this job and he could not afford to lose it. And during his lunch break, when the other workers sat under the trees eating their sandwiches and talking and laughing, Samuel would walk to the far corner of the garden where nobody could see him, and he would eat grass and leaves and sometimes flowers if they looked like they might be edible. And it helped a little bit with the hunger pains that gnawed at his stomach like a small animal trying to eat its way out. Richard listened to all of this with his mouth slightly open, and his face had gone pale, and his hands were clenched into fists at his sides, and he felt something hot and painful rising up in his throat, and he realized with shock that he was close to crying, which was something he had not done in more years than he could remember. And Samuel kept talking, filling the silence with all the things he had been holding inside for months, and he said that he had tried to get a second job, but he was already working here 6 days a week, and he was too tired at the end of each day to do anything else. And he had applied for assistance programs, but there was so much paperwork and so many requirements, and he made just slightly too much money to qualify for most of them, even though that money was all going to keep his daughter alive and his grandchildren. Samuel's voice cracked when he talked about Maya, and he said she was only 32 years old, which was far too young to be this sick, and she had always been healthy and strong and full of life, and then one day she started feeling tired all the time and her feet swelled up, and she thought it was just stress from working 2 jobs and raising 2 kids alone. But then she collapsed at work, and the ambulance took her to the hospital, and the doctors did tests and gave her the bad news, and Samuel said he would do anything to save her, because she was his only child, and he loved her more than his own life. And if he could give her one of his kidneys, he would do it in a heartbeat. But the doctors had tested him and said he was not a match, and so all he could do was pay the bills and pray and hope that a donor would be found before it was too late. Richard felt his throat tighten, and he had to swallow hard several times, and he said, "Why did you not tell me any of this, Samuel? And why did you not ask for help?" And Samuel looked up at him with those tired eyes that had seen too much pain, and he said, "Because you have already done so much for me, Mr. Morrison." And Richard said, "What do you mean? I have done nothing." And Samuel shook his head and said, "No. You gave me this job 8 years ago when nobody else would hire me because I had been in prison when I was younger for something stupid I did when I was just a kid, and you looked past that and you gave me a chance, and you have always treated me fairly and paid me on time, and you have never called me names or treated me like I was less than human, the way some other employers did, and I could not ask you for more when you had already given me so much. And besides, these are my problems, not yours, and I am supposed to be able to take care of my own family without begging for charity from anyone." Richard felt something break inside his chest like a wall crumbling down, and he realized that Samuel saw asking for help as begging, and saw himself as someone who should be grateful for basic human decency. And Richard understood in that moment that he had been blind for a very long time, and he had congratulated himself for being a good employer because he followed the law and paid fair wages and did not discriminate. But he had never once looked deeper, and he had never once asked any of his employees about their lives or their families or their struggles, and he had treated them like they were just parts of the machinery that kept his life running smoothly, and Samuel had been suffering right in front of him for months. And Richard had not noticed, because he had not bothered to truly see the man who took care of his gardens and made his home beautiful. Richard said, "Samuel, I need you to listen to me very carefully," and his voice was rough with emotion. And he said, "You are not going to eat grass ever again. Do you understand me? And we are going to fix this situation." And Samuel started to protest and say that he could not accept charity. But Richard held up his hand and said, "This is not charity. This is me being a human being and helping another human being who needs help. And that is what we are supposed to do for each other. And tomorrow morning you and I are going to sit down and you are going to tell me everything about your daughter's medical bills and what she needs. And we are going to figure this out together." Richard Morrison did not just write a check and walk away from the situation, even though that would have been the easy thing to do and the thing that would have made him feel good about himself without requiring any real change in his life. But something had shifted deep inside him when he saw Samuel eating grass in his garden, and that shift had cracked open something in his heart that he did not even know had been closed, and he realized that this was not just about helping one man and his family, but about changing the way he lived his entire life and the way he saw the world and the people in it. The first thing Richard did was contact the hospital where Maya was being treated, and he paid off all of her medical bills in one payment, and the hospital administrators were shocked because they had never seen anyone pay such a large amount all at once. And Richard also set up a fund to cover all of Maya's future medical expenses, including the transplant surgery whenever a donor became available, and he made sure that the best doctors and specialists were assigned to her case and that she would receive the highest quality care without Samuel having to worry about money ever again. And when Samuel found out what Richard had done, he broke down crying in the middle of the garden where he was working, and he could not stop saying thank you over and over until his voice was hoarse. But Richard did not stop there because he realized that if Samuel had been struggling this badly, then there were probably other people who worked for him or worked for his company who were facing similar hardships, and he had just never bothered to find out about them. And so he called a meeting with all the executives at his company, and he told them about what had happened with Samuel, and some of them looked uncomfortable when he described finding Samuel eating grass. And Richard said this happened because we have built a system where we pay people what we think is fair. And then we assume that is enough, and we never look deeper to see if our employees are actually okay, and we never ask about their lives or their families or what keeps them up at night, worrying. Richard announced that he was creating an employee assistance fund with $10 million of his own money, and any employee of his company who faced a medical emergency or a family crisis or any kind of financial hardship could apply for help from this fund without having to beg or feel ashamed. And there would be people whose job it was to help employees navigate these difficult situations and connect them with resources and support. And Richard also changed the health insurance policy for the entire company so that it covered more medical expenses and had lower deductibles, and he increased the base salary for all the lowest-paid workers because he realized that what he had thought was fair might not actually be enough for people to live on with dignity. Some of the executives pushed back and said that this was going to cost the company too much money and that shareholders would be unhappy and that it was not Richard's responsibility to solve all of his employees' problems. But Richard said he did not care what the shareholders thought, and he was the majority owner anyway, so they could not fire him. And he said that a company that made billions of dollars in profit every year could afford to take care of the people who made that profit possible. And if they could not do that, then what was the point of all that success and all that money? And the executives realized that Richard was serious and that he was not going to change his mind, so they stopped arguing and started implementing the changes he wanted. Richard also changed things at his mansion, and he started actually talking to the people who worked for him and learning their names and asking about their families and their lives, and he found out that his housekeeper Maria had a son who was trying to go to college but could not afford it. So Richard set up a scholarship fund for the children of his household employees, and he found out that his chef Tom had always dreamed of opening his own restaurant but did not have the capital. So Richard offered to invest in his dream, and he found out that his driver James had a mother in a nursing home that he could barely afford to pay for, so Richard increased his salary and gave him a bonus to cover the costs, and every single person who worked For Richard had a story and had struggles and had dreams, and Richard had never bothered to ask about any of it until now. The situation with Maya took an unexpected turn about 3 weeks after Richard had paid off her medical bills, and Richard went to visit her in the hospital because he wanted to meet the woman whose suffering had changed his life. And Maya was thin and tired, but she had a beautiful smile, and she thanked him for everything he had done, and they talked for a while about her children and her hopes for the future, and Richard felt moved by her strength and her grace despite everything she had been through. And when he left the hospital that day, he could not stop thinking about her and about how young she was and how unfair it was that she was stuck in that bed waiting for a kidney that might never come. Richard went home and did something he had not done in years, and he got down on his knees and prayed, even though he was not sure he believed in God anymore. After so many years of focusing only on business and money and success, and he prayed that Maya would find a donor and that she would survive, and that her children would get to have their mother back. And then he had a thought that seemed to come from somewhere outside himself, and he wondered if maybe he could be the donor. And at first he dismissed the idea as crazy because he barely knew this woman. And why would he give up one of his own organs for a stranger? But the thought would not leave him alone, and it kept coming back stronger and stronger, until finally he called the hospital and asked if he could be tested to see if he was a match. The doctors were surprised by his request, and they warned him that kidney donation was serious surgery with risks and a long recovery time, and Richard said he understood, but he wanted to be tested anyway. And so they ran all the tests and drew blood and did scans, and 2 weeks later they called him with results that seemed almost too perfect to be real, and they said he was a match. And not just any match, but an excellent match. And the surgery could be scheduled as soon as Richard was ready, and Richard felt his heart pounding in his chest, and he knew this was something he had to do, not because he owed it to Samuel, or because it would make him look good, but because it was the right thing to do, and because giving this gift might be the most meaningful thing he ever did with his life. The surgery was scheduled for 6 weeks later, and during that time, Richard got to know Samuel and Maya and the grandchildren much better, and they became like family to him in a way that felt more real than many of his actual relationships. And Lisa and Marcus started calling him Uncle Richard, and they would visit him at the mansion and swim in his pool and run through his gardens and their laughter-filled spaces that had been empty and silent for too long. And Samuel and Richard worked side by side in the garden sometimes. And they talked about life and faith and what really mattered, and Richard learned more from those conversations than he had learned in 20 years of business meetings. The day of the surgery arrived, and Richard was nervous, but also strangely calm. And Samuel held his hand before they wheeled him into the operating room, and Samuel had tears streaming down his face, and he said, "I will never be able to repay you for this." And Richard said, "You do not need to repay me because you already gave me something much more valuable, and you showed me what it means to be truly human." And Samuel did not understand what Richard meant, but Richard said, "You will understand someday." And then they took him away and put him to sleep. And when he woke up many hours later, he was in a hospital bed with pain in his side and tubes and monitors attached to him, and the first thing he asked was, "How is Maya?" And the nurse smiled and said, "She is doing great." And the surgery was a complete success. Richard and Maya recovered in hospital rooms right next to each other, and Samuel spent his time going back and forth between them and bringing them things they needed and reading to them and keeping them company, and the three of them formed a bond that would last for the rest of their lives. And after they were released from the hospital and had recovered at home for several weeks, Maya came to visit Richard at his mansion, and she hugged him and cried and said, "You gave me my life back, and I get to see my children grow up because of you." And Richard cried too. And he said, "No, you gave me my life back. Because before I met you and your father, I was just existing and making money and accumulating things. But I was not really living." Years passed, and Maya got stronger and healthier, and she was able to go back to work and watch her children grow. And eventually she met a good man who loved her, and they got married, and Samuel continued working at the mansion. But now he and Richard were genuine. Friends who shared meals together and talked about everything, and Richard had transformed not just Samuel's life, but his own life, and the lives of everyone who worked for him, and he became known in the business community as someone who actually cared about people, and not just profits. And other wealthy people asked him why he had changed so much, and he always told them the same story about finding Samuel eating grass in his garden.